I'm sharing 5 brutally honest secrets I wish I'd known at the start of med school. Learning these helped me succeed at Stanford Med and match at Harvard-MGH while having time to get married, do research, and travel around the world. So whether you're a pre-med student or already in the thick of it, these insights could help you avoid common pitfalls and make the most of your training. And be sure to stick around till the end where I'll talk about the #1 thing that helped me cut down my studying by hours each day. Let's dive in. So the first secret is that you're responsible for your own education. When I started medical school, I think that I was surprised at how bad I thought the lectures were. It took me a while to realize that the reason why the lectures were bad wasn't because the people giving the lectures were bad, but actually because their incentives weren't aligned so that they could provide a quality education. So what do I mean by that? In high school, if you had a class and you had some assignments that counted for your grade and other assignments that didn't count for your grade, then generally, right, people, if they're rational, would work on the things that counted towards their grade. That is true at every level, and that's also true for medical school lecturers. And so medical school lecturers, in most cases, are not paid for teaching. That's important because they are paid for their research and or they are paid for their clinical practice. And so what that means practically is that teaching becomes a really, really low priority. And if anything, it becomes this distraction for them towards the things that they are actually getting rewarded for. That's not to say that there aren't good lecturers. I actually think that there are some remarkable lecturers who work against their sort of economic incentives in order to provide really, really good education. But I would argue that that actually is the exception that proves the rule. Now, if this sounds familiar, a lot of research universities and large famous schools for undergraduate, that is essentially the problem and the criticism of those schools. What's different for medical school is that the lecture structure is fundamentally different from anything you've probably experienced prior. And so in undergrad, what most students have experienced is that there's one professor that teaches the entire course. In med school, that now becomes different. So you have multiple lecturers, oftentimes specialists in their particular field, teaching small portions of a given organ system. So for example, when I was at Stanford, we would have 3 lectures per day in the morning, and each of those lectures was typically given by a different person. And oftentimes, the people that gave one lecture wouldn't be the same that would give another. In addition to having a sort of disincentive towards education based on the system, you also have the fact that there's really no one person outside of maybe the course director who is responsible for the overall student's comprehension of a particular topic. So what does this mean for you as a medical student? I'm not blaming them because if I wasn't paid or promoted based off of my teaching, then I'm gonna try and spend the least amount of time putting together something, right, for the most part. And it's going to be something like my research, or it's going to be something I already know a lot about or have a presentation already regarding. What that means though is that you are going to be responsible for your own education. So you have to be able to make the connections between the content yourself. You have to find the fundamental concepts. You have to be the one that's going to put it together. And so the phrase that I commonly would think of as a medical student was, it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility. And so I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind before you enter medical school, to know that there are going to be some things that systemically are going to make it harder for you to have a cohesive education. It's not going to be your fault, but you do have the responsibility of making sure that you can put it all together. The second secret that I wish that I'd understood is that you're probably going to compare yourself to other people, and it's ultimately not going to matter. And so the comparison game is really prevalent in medical school. I mean, you've got a lot of people who are really, really successful and are used to being near the top of their class, and you're putting them all together, and then you're, creating limited spots for desired specialties or desired residencies or desired locations. And there's gonna be not enough spots for, say, like research opportunities in some cases. And so there's practical reasons for why you're gonna compare yourself to other people, because it's gonna feel sometimes like you are competing with your classmates. The thing that people worry about the most when they fail one of their exams isn't necessarily how it affects their residency application, which obviously is something that they worry about. But the #1 thing that people talk about when they fail step 1 or step 2 is, it's really hard for me to watch my classmates move forward and to move on to the next level where I'm still stuck where I am. And so again, I think that there's across all levels, there's a strong sense of wanting to compare ourselves to other people, both as a motivator, right? Because we want to see how other people are doing, and so it can be a positive thing. But also, I think that it can have like a more negative side. And I think that one of the most negative sides is when people are comparing themselves to other people, but also not sharing their weaknesses. And so there's this sort of false perception misconception of effortless success that I think is common in medical school, where people show only the best parts of themselves and then hide the things that they're afraid of. When I was in medical school, if I thought back to the comparisons that I made in high school or the comparisons I made in college, it really didn't matter, right? It's like all those people that I may have, compared myself to or felt, insecure around, it just didn't matter that much. I mean, honestly, it didn't matter at all. And so I think that having that perspective going into medical school would have been really helpful. A, to know that everyone has those same insecurities, everyone has those same sorts of doubts, that even if they don't necessarily show it, like the Stanford duck syndrome. And B, to have the perspective of, okay, so moving towards the future, like, am I really gonna care about this in a month? Am I really gonna care about this in a year or in 10 years? And I can tell you now that it's been 15 years since I entered medical school, that it really doesn't matter. Like, all the things that I worried about, all the comparisons that I made, they really don't matter. And, I talked to friends that I had at the time and where I was, comparing myself to them, and it just doesn't matter. We're all in different places in our lives. We're all in different specialties and all in different, field, all in different locations. And, it just didn't matter. And so I think having that perspective when I entered, I think would have been helpful. And it's something that I wish that I'd known when I had started medical school. Secret number 3 is that it's a marathon and not a sprint. And so it's gonna be really easy to kind of get into that mentality of like, okay, just thinking about my next exam. It's also really easy to get into this sort of like binge and cram and forget cycle where it's like, you're gonna do everything to try to pass that next exam, try to keep up with, with your next test. But like, just kind of burn yourself out on both ends. I think one of the most important lessons that I learned early on in medical school was they said that if you want to guarantee that you're going to do something in the future, make sure that you do it today. And so if you want to have a fulfilling family life, or if you want to have fulfilling relationships, or if you want to be well, then the best way to guarantee that your future self is going to have those things is to make sure that your present self is doing it. And so again, remember that it's a long journey. One of the best ways of making sure that you have a good long journey is to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and doing the right things now. The fourth secret that I wish that I had known was that knowing yourself is one of the most important aspects for choosing your medical specialty. So it might seem kind of odd that I'm talking about, your specialty choice, especially if, you are a pre-med or you're just starting medical school, because it might seem like it's a really, really distant thing, which in many ways that's true. And oftentimes these things are going to change. Now, that said, your medical specialty will end up being one of the most crucial decisions that you make in medical school. And so unlike in college where your major, like I was a chemistry major and I was a French minor, right? Like it didn't really affect much if anything about my future lifestyle, right? Didn't affect my income, didn't really affect my job opportunities, didn't affect like how much free time I had. In medical school, your medical specialty, like in your medical career, your medical specialty has a dramatic effect on all of those things. And so not only does that have a major effect on your future career as well as your future lifestyle, it's also not something that you're going to be able to undo very easily. And so, for example, I trained in anesthesiology. For me, if I wanted to go to another specialty like internal medicine, I would have to do another residency, right? I would have to apply and go through that entire match process. And like, it would be at least another 3 years or 4 years of my life, depending on, when I applied and started, for me to switch careers into another specialty. And so how it is that you make this decision is really important. Now, I know that might sound really scary. And for me, that was. And so when I started, I didn't have really any medical professionals in my family. I didn't take a traditional route in terms of shadowing before I went to medical school. If you're like me and you don't have a lot of experience with, knowing like the ins and outs of the different specialties, that's okay. What I don't think I realized when I started is that knowing the details of the specialties doesn't matter nearly as much as knowing yourself. For example, my advisor when I was at Stanford, Dr. Oscar Salvatierra, would have us do an exercise where he would help us sort of think through what sort of specialty we were most interested in. And what was interesting is that it really had nothing, like the exercise had very little to do with the specialties themselves and had much more to do with our own values. And so what he said is make a list of the 5 most important personal life goals that you have and the 5 most important career goals that you have. And then once you have those, well, you'd have this list of all of the, your 5 most important life goals and your 5 most important career goals. And then on the top, you would have different specialties that you were considering. And what you would basically do is you would then rank these specialties based off of how well they fit with the different personal and career goals. So for example, in my case, some of my goals were I wanted to spend time with family, I wanted to have enough time to travel, I wanted to have time where I could spend time with friends. And so like, it wasn't hard for me. Like the hard part wasn't realizing like, oh, okay, like certain specialties are going to have more free time. Like that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was actually really defining clearly what my most important personal life goals were and what my most important career goals were. And so even if you are starting and you know nothing about medical specialties, you can do this at any time. And frankly, I would recommend, if I could go back to my earlier self, I wish that I had spent more time really reflecting on these things before I'd started, because you don't have that much time when you're in school, right? There's all these things where it's like, you'll tell yourself, oh, in the future, I'll do this, like it'll be fine. If I had just spent more time thinking about these things earlier on, I think it would have been easier for me to make career decisions, I think, later on. And so the key is that if you want to succeed in your goals, you have to be very, very clear on what it is that you want to do. Because if you don't achieve them, right? If I don't achieve them, it's not going to be because I wasn't clear on what it is I wanted to do. It's because I allowed myself to get distracted by things that were important but less important to me. And so I think that it's really important before you start medical school, or I mean, as early as you can in the process, to really think, what are those 5 things? Like, what would you put as your 5 things, both in your personal life as well as in your career, so that you can really try to match a career and a specialty with those goals. So the 5th secret I wish that I'd known is that you should prepare it not just for your next exam, but also your future exams. And so what do I mean by that? We talked about how medical school exams are really misleading. And so they're gonna focus a lot on rote memorization and basic recall. This creates problems on 2 fronts. One is that practically you're gonna have to take step 1 and pass it. And you're going to have to do really, really well in step 2, because obviously that's going to be the thing, the scored exam that residencies are gonna look at. So from an exam standpoint, that's gonna create problems because having shallow knowledge is a really poor way to do well in those exams. The second problem that creates is that if you wanna be a good doctor, it really benefits you to understand these things beyond just being able to regurgitate facts. The best way that you can solve both of those problems is to don't worry about your next, passing your next exam so much as try to really understand the concepts behind what it is that you're learning. A really good model for understanding medicine, or I think a lot of science concepts, is the spiral staircase model. And so the idea is that you're sort of like descending, going further and further down a spiral staircase, all while looking at the same thing. The major difference is that even though you're looking at the same thing, you're seeing it at a greater depth. And so in the beginning of medical school, that might look like, okay, well, I need to understand the pathophysiology, I might understand a bit about the presentation, but I'm really learning sort of the classic presentations of these things. As you go further on in your career, what you're going to find is that you're gonna have to learn more about how you diagnose it, and you're gonna have to learn more about how you manage it, and you're gonna have to learn more about the subtleties of how it is that you actually work up and treat these conditions. I think one of the best pieces of advice I received as a medical student was, there was a fellow at Stanford who was a pediatric anesthesia fellow who said that, you know, the way that he was like the only one that ended up getting a job offer at the time among his class. And he said that his secret, I mean, he didn't quite say it like this, but he said that his secret for preparing was always thinking about the next level up. And so when he was a medical student, he was always thinking like, okay, well, how is the intern thinking? Like, what is their thought process? And trying to really sort of plan ahead and figure that out. When he was an intern, he was then thinking like, okay, like, well, what's the resident thinking? What's the senior resident what is going on in their mind as they're working up and managing these patients? And then when he was a resident, he then was thinking like, what's the attending doing? And so that process can start early on, right? What you wanna do is you wanna think like, okay, don't just worry about what it is that you're doing right now, but think about, okay, like, how am I gonna need this in the future for my exams? And most importantly, how am I gonna use this as a future physician? Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you can see all of the related content that we have about how to prepare well for your board exams. Fundamentally though, what you're trying to do is you wanna learn 3 things. You wanna learn 1, you wanna learn things well, whatever it is that you're doing, right? So understand things from a principle-based standpoint rather than just memorize and regurgitate the information. Second, you wanna have a system so that once you learn it, you never forget it. Because again, these conditions are gonna come back. And so you wanna make sure that your knowledge can just be an ever-expanding sphere. The final thing is that you wanna learn how to apply it. And again, there's a lot of material that we have on the channel already about these things, and we'll have a lot more in the future. I think the key lesson that I wish that I had known early on was to always be thinking about the future, right? Always be planning ahead to reverse engineer what it is that I want to accomplish and how it is that I want to use this information. If you've made it this far, you're already well ahead of the majority of med students when they start school. But if you want to go even further, be sure to check out this video on First Aid for Step 1 Top Mistakes, where we'll dive into the best and worst ways to use this critical resource.